Namaskar, everyone. Welcome to our new reading session. Today we'll be reading, we'll be starting the Seedbed of Pakistan by Sir Saumya Dey. He is an independent researcher and a very great scholar. We will not waste much time. We'll get straight to the reading. But first of all, we can just tell you guys that you should definitely buy this book. As you can see, it's available in Amazon and other platforms also. So definitely check it out. The price is also not much. So yeah, definitely check it out. So let's start reading. The Seedbed of Pakistan, cultural conflicts, elite Muslim anxieties, and the Congress. The feet of my step upon the new Congress related into victims of partition. As you can also see the thumbnail. I've given two pictures. Both of them are from the Sylhet during the partition of Sylhet Hindus. They're of Sylhet Hindus. We'll skip the acknowledgements. We'll start from introduction. Introduction. Let me just zoom it a bit. British ruled India was partitioned into the two dominions of India and Pakistan in 1947. The cataclysm displaced enormous numbers of human beings. Millions of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims found themselves on the wrong side of a hurriedly etched international border and grudged to in India or Pakistan. Simultaneously, hundreds of thousands riots in the sanguinary riots that backdrop partition. Old neighbors fell upon and slaughtered each other in savage, bestial fury in many cities and the countless towns and villages. Although three generations have passed since this monstrous human tragedy unfolded, its traumatic memories are yet to fade. We still, as a result, look for the roots of this tragedy. We continue to search for what might have led to partition and the emergence of Pakistan in the political bedlam that characterized India in the 1930s and 40s. More specifically, we look to pin the blame for the enormous cataclysm that was partisan on some cogent reason or identifiable agency. Now, most important scholarship agrees that the Congress stood for Indian unity throughout. Though one might personally want to nurture a different point of view. Scholarly speculations thus generally revolve around Muhammad Ali Jinnah's role and intentions in the political drama surrounding partition. Aisha Jalal seems to think that he did not quite want Pakistan and meant it only as a bargaining counter. Anita Inder Singh, on the other hand, appears to indicate that Jinnah did, after all, want partition and the establishment of Pakistan. It is indeed tempting to engage with and contribute to these speculations and points of view, gives it gives one the chance to contemplate and dilate on the sensational course of developments, leading to the blood-drenched sundering of British India. This book shall, however, not do so, as is clearly indicated by the period it considers. Instead, the intention of this relatively brief narrative is to examine what might be termed the discursive foundations of the Pakistan idea in the way of certain tendencies, psychologies, perspectives, and political maneuvers. The political maneuvers discernible over the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a national congress tried to overcome the opposition of some upper class Muslims along with indifference from Muslims at large. This book shall survey, one might say, the seedbed of Pakistan. This is so that we may acquire a rather fresh and more nuanced understanding of the late colonial politics that eventually resulted in its creation. An unmistakable fact about colonial India is that the elite segment of Indian Muslim society, namely the Ashraf, largely chose to show their own political parole. Leading members of Ashraf society as still staunchly opposed the Congress after it was founded in 1885. Syed Ahmad Khan, for instance, supported neither the Congress's imagination of Indian nationhood nor the political reforms demanded by it. Eventually, in 1906, A number of the Ashraf approached the colonial establishment and demanded that it grant the Indian Muslims proportional representation on a communal basis. In other words, these Indo-Muslim elites, as we shall term the Ashraf, sought to establish Indian Muslims as a distinct political interest group deserving of special consideration, styling themselves the similar deputation. These gentlemen even termed the Indian Muslims a nation as they met with Lord Minto in the summer capital of British India. Exactly 3 months after the date, the All India Muslim League was founded in Dhaka, again by prominent Indian Muslim elites. The AIML, it sounds like uh, it sounds like we are reading artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it's All India Muslim League as mentioned here. The AIML, we might say, was but an organizational expression of the similar deputation's points of view in the long term. It sought to champion the ostensibly distinct political interests of Indian Muslims and eventually in 1940 argued that they, being a nation in their own right, ought to have their own territorial state. In little over 7 years after the Lahore resolution was passed by the AML, Pakistan was the reality. Why did the Indo-Muslim elite keep aloof from the Congress's articulation of Indian nationhood as well as its political program? Going by what some influential scholars have to say, it might seem that it was largely due to how the colonial states stood in relation to a generally backward Indian Muslim society. For instance, as Peter Hardy puts it, Indian Muslims acquired a separate social as well as religious personality. When the British rulers sought to address their backwardness in education, Hardy suggests that they did so after becoming very conscious of the Indian Muslims, sometimes a whole, sometimes as a phantom, sometimes as a Frankenstein's monster, but always a bogus. Apparently, while the British were intervening as a colonial power in the center of the Muslim world, the seemingly extraterritorial loyalties of the Indian Muslims were causing them concern. The upper strata of Indian Muslims, on their part, responded to the colonial state's willingness to accommodate Muslim interests. As Hardy writes, a perceptive Muslim of the educated classes could see in the 1870s and early 80s that the British were ready to treat Muslims as a distinct political interest in India. If any viewers or if anybody of you have any questions or any comments, then kindly put them in the comment live chat. You can use English, Hindi, or Bengali, anything. They will be answered or discussed later in the stream after I finish reading some part. So definitely do comment. And also, we can discuss here that you can see that Ashraf and upper class Muslim, first strata Muslim is being discussed very thoroughly. These Ashrafs or upper caste Muslim, these terms aren't so mainstream as you can see in the current political scenario or the narrative, but they play a very crucial role from the British times on. Still, I mean, you can see Asaduddin Owaisi and his brothers and others also. Every Muslim you see in a good position or a good political power, he or she has to be a upper caste Muslim, like Asraf or many others. So let us continue. Muslim Hasham, on the other hand, appears to think that Muslims mobilized as a distinct political interest group in India because the colonial state did not cater to them through their patronage, they catered to them through patronage and dispersal of resources. As he puts it, a separate and distinct political consciousness among Indian Muslims was caused by their placement in the political and economic structures and their access to the levers of power, authority, and influence under colonial rule. That is why he says communal antipathy was the greatest in Bengal since Muslims had virtually no access to the resources of the province. Thus, in effect, like Hardy, Hassan too argues that at the root of Indian Muslim politics lay backwardness. It is only that he arrives at these arguments through a different route. M. Mujib, author of a classic and exhaustive study titled The Indian Muslim, appears to be on the same page as Hardy and Hassan. The realization of being backward subjects of a non-Muslim state was the reason why, which it seemingly insinuates the Indian Muslims developed their own unique political point of view. See, so their agenda was forming pretty long back, and once it got formed, still the same. I mean, you can say that it got formed long back at 1500 years ago only, but still in Indian politics, how they were spreading their tentacles. The contentions of Hadi, Hassan, and Mujib might seem compelling at first glance, but are exposed to be rather ill-founded on closer scrutiny. The Indo-Muslim elites or the Ashraf, who were at the helm of Muslim politics in colonial India, were anything but backward. Nor did they generally base their politics on the educational or economic cleverness of Muslim. Francis Robinson, as a matter of fact, points out how Muslims were a rather dominant minority in the United Provinces, disproportionately well represented in both land ownership and government jobs. In his schema, this class of Muslims began to politically organize as there was an erosion of their erstwhile status in the province. For example, he writes that the colonial administration attempts to introduce Western learning and promote vernaculars, strengthen their religious beliefs, social customs, and political position. Simultaneously, bureaucratic reforms reduced these elites' power, and the introduction of elective principle in local government undermined its influence. Based on what Francis Robinson said, one is tempted to think that the politics of the Indo-Muslim elite might have been motivated by cultural concerns and distrust of representative democracy. This is probably why, Farzana Sheikh observes, this is probably why, as Farzana Sheikh observes, the Ashraf brought a very culturally derived language to their politics, which was meant to establish how special they were. Regardless of numbers, as it seems, this might be because they had once formed the apex of the ruling class structure, which had made some Mongol Mughal ideas a part of their political thinking. Also, said things that some of the Ashraf political psychology was Islamically derived and drew upon assumptions familiar to Muslim political discourse. Since the consolidation of Islam as a world religion, the substantive implication of such observation from our point of view is that an examination of Ashraf politics must factor in their Mughal heritage as well as the moral imagination that is from Islam. Let this be the note on which we commence our narrative. So this is very, very important. As I said, that upper stratum is known as Ashraf, and the Ashraf build their own agenda, own narrative, and their own thoughts in politics. That is the Ashraf politics. So we'll examine it and also discuss it further. As a society, the Indo-Muslim elite had been brought home by the Mughal Empire, and one may contain represented its cultural discourse. Every state has a cultural persona, or rather, as these books will argue, states are culture power formation. They project and broadcast power through cultural symbols or props. The cultural persona of the Mughal Empire, it is contained in this was Islamic. It projected power using cultural tropes and symbols broadly associable with Muslims as a society. This is where to begin with a moral discourse derived from Islam, the Persian language, and association with Sufi holy men. Betterment of the cultural displays of non-Muslims was also an aspect of the Islamic cultural persona of the Mughal Empire. The Ashraf formed the bureaucratic vanguard of the Islamic culture power formation that was the Mughal Empire. They thus represented the Islamic cultural paradigm as a society. Both the moral discourse of Islam and Sufi spirituality were reflected in their lives, and they displayed a strong preference for Persian and the Persianate tongue of Urdu. They might also, in association with non-elite Muslims curtail the cultural disciplines of non-Muslims. The Ashram dominated the semi-urban settlements in the Gangetic heartland or Kasbah and lent them a broadly Islamic cultural appearance. So as you can see, they are building their weapons. With the onset of the 19th century, we see that the Ashraf or the Indo-Muslim elite are finding the going rather difficult as both administrators and land controllers. Simultaneously, we notice the ascendant Hindu elites getting assertive in the urban spaces that the Ashraf had formerly administered or dominated. There are also outbreaks of Hindu-Muslim strife. There is thus a relative decline in the temporal status of the Ashraf, the Indo-Muslim elite, are ceasing to be a dominant minority. The open disregard for their way of life that the new rulers showed, however, is likely to have distressed them more. The British did not hold much function for the cultural traces that distinguish the Indo-Muslim elite. And the initial response to the emotional anguish that Indo-Muslim elite society was undergoing came from the ulama, an important component thereof. I hope every one of you guys are very pretty much aware or recognize recognize this fact, ulama. I mean, you have heard Anand Ranganathan and many others saying this word pretty frequent or pretty often. This is understandable since Indian Muslim was without totally patronage under the new political dispensation. The ulama themselves, on the other hand, were gradually denied a role in the functioning of the colonial state. In this situation, the ulama themselves, on the other hand, were gradually denied a role in the functioning of the colonial state. In this situation, they took it upon themselves to protect and nurture the Islamic heritage of India. Islamic heritage, by the way. The ulama launched into reform efforts that left Indian Islam quite transformed. By abolishing a slew of local cultural practices, the reformist ulama, in a way, re-engineered Indian Muslim society and rendered it more culturally and politically cohesive. These reform efforts made the elite and non-elite Indian Muslims come together. I, I hope you can guess what are these reforms will be, and we will discuss it later, obviously. Let, let you guess. In the process, we might say the Indo-Muslim elite acquired a conspicuous leadership conspicuous leadership role in broader Indian Muslim society. Alongside, the Indo-Muslim elite were in search of their own iteration of modernity. This quest first expressed itself as the hybrid seminary at Deoband. It was very largely inspired by the Delhi college established by the colonial administration and was an institution somewhat in the Western mold. Later, the Indo-Muslim elite set about acquiring a more obviously Western-inspired modernity at the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, founded in Aligarh in 1875. This brainchild of Syed Ahmad Khan, a prominent Sarif, was meant to regenerate Indian Muslim society at large and reconcile it with Western religion and British rule. At this historical juncture, with the Ashraf very delicately poised, the Islamic cultural tropes and cherished by them came under vigorous assault. For instance, the British unstated the Persian language as a medium of court proceedings. The Hindus of the Gangetic heartland, on the other hand, waged extremely aggressive agitation promoting Hindi Nagari against Urdu and regulations for how protection. They wanted Hindi written in the Devanagari script to be the granted and official position equivalent to Urdu and specific Muslims from sacrificing cows on Bakri by resorting to violence. So the Hindus were also fighting. I mean, pre independence era, by the way. So they were pretty aware at this time. Further, Hindus were achieving translocal solidarity as a society or community or communities by conducting their public religious ceremonies with greater verve. In the process, the Islamic ambience of the cosmos became hard to sustain for the Indo-Muslim elite. There was, in other words, a proper cultural conflict underway in North India at this historical turn, with Hindus deploying and asserting their cultural symbols against the Indian Muslim society. This cultural conflict was this cultural conflict was excel, this cultural conflict was exacerbated by the introduction of local self-government. Due to their advantage in numbers, Hindus were successful in municipal politics than Muslims. They would gain control of the local boards and often seek to implement their cultural agenda. The franchise and representative institutions thus were further imperiling the Islamic cultural paradigm which had once been hegemonic in the urban spaces of North India. The Indian National Congress was established against the backdrop of intensifying cultural conflicts and Hindu assertion in colonial North India. It arrived on the scene with a somewhat unstable conception of Indian nationhood and demands for what seemed to its detractors radical political reforms. The Congress visualized the Indian nation as a purely civic entity, while also implifying that it is a federation of religious and normative groups which are internally autonomous in terms of values and more. We see that the Congress refused to discuss matters of social reform so as to realize its imagination of the Indian nation as an expedient measure which restricted itself to the political issues that were supposedly relevant to all its constituents. This meant that it was an option for groups of or individuals to refuse to be counted in the Indian nation of the Congress's imagination. We see that is precisely what happened. The Congress found it hard to explain the relatively small numbers of Muslim delegates at its annual sessions. It seemed like Muslims were unwilling to join the Indian nation that the Congress had meant to bring forth. So again, here we can see the the Islamic or the Muslims agenda were very clear from very first. It seemed like Muslims were unwilling to join the Indian nation that the Congress had meant to bring forth. And then prominent Ashraf or Indo-Muslim elites such as Nawab Abdul Latif, Syed Amar Ali, and Syed Ahmad Khan all dished the Congress. Khan in particular emphatically denied that India could claim to be a nation as he corresponded with Badruddin Tyagi, a lawyer from Bombay who had presided over the annual congressation in 1887. These Ashraf were all wary of the Congress since it demanded franchise-based representative bodies at the provincial and central levels of British India. Syed Ahmad Khan termed this monstrous and unreasonable. He feared that the introduction of the vote and representative institutions in the country would put Muslims completely at the mercy of the Hindu majority, since the latter four times outnumbered the former. The Aligarh Institute Gazette, very likely taking its editorial cue from him, was pretty blunt in stating that Hindus might use the franchise and the domination of an Indian parliament to reintroduce Sati and ban house water. The Indo-Muslim elite were visibly anxious on account of the Congress's political program, clearly deriving this anxiety from the cultural conflicts that were underway and Muslims' experience with local level politics. After some initial inactivity, the Congress made multiple maneuvers to soothe this anxiety and bring around the Indo-Muslim elite. Badruddin Tyabji corresponded with Khan and Syed Omar Ali at various points in 1887 and 1888 and urged them to come over to Congress with their unique Muslim point of view. They did not listen. Later, later, later convening in Allahabad, the Congress institutionalized communal vetoes through a resolution that laid down that it would not take up any matter for discussion to which the Hindu Muslim delegates objected. The move was to have the branch out. The Congress was accepted proportional representation for religious groups in principle at its 1889 annual session. While it did, Muslims from its own ranks rose to demand first parity and then weightage for Indian Muslims in political representation. Over the 1890s, Muslim participation in the Congress plummeted. On the other hand, Congress ceased to engage with the anxieties, anxi- anxieties, uh, yes, anxieties of the Indo-Muslim elite. It even unilaterally termed itself the sole representative of the Indian nation. Things, things did not change in the next century. Muslims continued to avoid the Congress, perhaps because it now it is anxiety. So, I comment there a bit anyway. The colonial demanded things did not change in the next century. Muslims continued to avoid the Congress, perhaps because it now demanded representative bodies on an elected basis with greater confidence and urgency. The colonial state finally showed a willingness to consider this demand in 1906. As it became known, Nawab Muslim ul Mulk, the secretary of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh, arranged for a Muslim delegation to be received by Lord Minto. It has gone down in history as the Simla deputation, a very famous deputation. This was a historical instant when the anxieties of the Indo-Muslim elite reigned mainstream in the politics of colonial India. The immediate outcome of this mainstreaming was the AIML, while the staggered outcomes, as this book shall argue, were the Lahore Resolution and the state of Pakistan. So, this was our introduction. And it's now we begin our first chapter. Just wait a minute. Yeah, this is our first chapter. The Mughal Empire and the Indo-Muslim alliance, the Islamicate legacy. Uh, so before we start reading the chapter, I will once again remind you guys to definitely purchase this amazing book from Amazon or any other platform where it is available, like Padega India or Amazon. It doesn't cost too much, so definitely purchase it. Let us start reading the first chapter of the book, and I guess we will keep it to the first chapter only in this game. So yeah, then we will continue the next chapter later. The Mughal Empire and the Indo-Muslim elite, the Islamic legacy. States were a culture. States were a culture. States have a cultural persona, or one could say that they were culture just as we human beings were garments. The cultural aspect of states could be discerned in the arena of geopolitics and international relations, since it seems to bear the potential of determining their dynamics. Apparently, states belonging to the same cultural sphere would gravitate towards each other and have the same friends and foes. As the controversial political scientist Samuel P. Huntington writes, cultural commonalities and differences shape the interest, antagonism, and association of states. Thus, he argues the Western countries formed NATO as their central security organization on account of their common values and philosophical assumptions. The European Union, on the other hand, is the product of a common European culture. The cultural persona of states sometimes becomes extremely obvious when they choose a side during an outbreak of international military conflict. According to Huntington, Muslims everywhere rallied against the Soviet Union when it intervened in Afghanistan, since in their eyes it was a civilizational war. Though he does not elaborate as to how the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was a civilizational war. It's unsafe to assume that that Muslim countries saw it as an instance of a godless communist state battling to belief. This chapter seeks to argue that the Mughal Empire manifested a cultural persona that can be from Islamicate. Further, it will contain that this Islamicate persona saves the Indo-Muslim elite since they inhabited the cultural spaces that it created and inherited the cultural forms and practices that constituted it. However, before we can advance these arguments, we must understand what state and culture actually are. Once we have done this, we shall take a historical overview of the relationship between the two, both in the European and Indian context, in order to develop some sense of the various forms and functionality it assumes. These exercises will help us contextualize and better understand the Mughal Empire as an Islamic state form and how the Indo-Muslim elite stood in relation to it. Understanding state and culture. Very important. How does one define the state? Though the question has generated an enormous amount of theoretical literature, we think a simple answer to it is possible. One could call the state the ultimate order enforcing authority. In the words of the social anthropologist Ernest, Ernest, Ernest Kellner, the state is that institution or set of institutions specifically concerned with the maintenance of order. Examples of the latter would be the police force and courts. According to Gaylor, the state comes into existence when these institutions have attained autonomy and separate out from the rest of social life. Thus, the state is those agencies which keep our persons and property safe and ensure that mobs do not normally riot in the streets. It is the state on account of which we have the confidence of returning alive when we step out of our homes to earn a livelihood in the morning. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors living in an age when neither the policeman nor the magistrate existed almost certainly lacked this confidence when leaving their caves to find nourishment. Quarreling over an antelope's leg or a bunch of berries, one caveman or woman would always train another. What is it exactly that makes the state capable of enforcing order? Well, it is power. The courts and the policemen enjoy legitimate power over us. You know that is how they protect us. So we could term the state on account of its order enforcing role, the systematic and institutionalized application of power. The state is a territorial society which enjoys within its allotted physical area, a supremacy over all other institutions. In other words, we could say that the state is that power which is, in ideal situation, final and incontrovertible, and incontrovertible within a delimited territory and upon a social body, a mass of human beings and all forms of association that compromise it. What is culture then? To answer this question, let us resort to the very influential observations of the famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz or Clifford Geertz. Anyway, we will call him Clifford. He espouses a semiotic conception of culture. In simple language, Geertz thinks or Geertz thinks that cultures are complexes of symbols. These symbols are both extremely potent and conspicuous. They are a set of some control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions for the governing of behavior. Their natural habitat is the household, the marketplace, and the town square. Culture is public, writes Gates, Clifford. Because meaning is apparently we are to understand culture as being meaning producing symbols that are all around. Culture is what is evocative and conspicuous. But how exactly does it govern our behavior? Clifford, Clifford says that it does so by organizing our thinking as traffic in significant symbols. We could build on this remark by Clifford and say that culture is sacred. Culture is sacred insignia such as the crescent, the cross, or the sacred syllable. or the sacred syllable, Om, that it is sacred books, signs, deities, sacred rites, ritual performances, and forms of behavior with meanings encoded into them. Culture is an entire range of evocative symbols which might frame and organize our psychology and from which we might derive thoughts and ideas. This is how cultures are set. This is how culture are sets of symbolic devices for controlling human behavior and historically created systems of meaning in terms of which we give form, order, point, and direction to our lives. The range of evocative symbols mentioned above, for example, is always element with a large mass of historically accumulated meanings. They can shape lives, choices, and extract the staunchest allegiance from human beings. And finally, culture is socially reproduced. From the point of view of an individual, the symbols that constitute it are largely given, and she or he finds them already current in the community when she or he is born. So we could end by terming culture a socially inherited habitus of meanings induced by symbols that regulate and lend purpose with human behavior and actions. That is why culture can be and so usually is such an effective instrument for power, for the state, for all states who are in the business of regulating and directing human behavior and actions in a social context. So, so what is state and understanding state and culture? Now, the interaction of state and culture, instances from Europe and India. So both have been defined now. Now, interaction between them. Historically, European states have acquired cultural personas through their espousal of a language or religion. This is understandable since culture and religion have been termed the central elements of any cultural or civilization. As we see, the former is the means through which we express meanings, while the latter is the repository of symbols, furnishing meanings. The modern European nation state largely originated through identification with a language, or it emerged as a standardized language that became the speech of a national community. How and why did this happen? There are some famous scholarly explanations. Okay, we put the how big is the purpose? Okay. So let us read up to uh, in our 1 hour. And according to the historian Eric Hobsbawm, European states were democratized in the 19th century and turned their subjects into citizens. Then warfare came to be such that it required the large-scale participation of ordinary people. As a result, European states had to perforce identify with the populations they ruled and seek legitimacy among them. Partly, they sought to do this by utilizing sentiments and symbols. European states thus invented traditions, the national anthem being an example. Okay, so there's an interesting fact. Partly, they sought to do this by utilizing sentiments and symbols. European states thus invented traditions, the national anthem being an example. Okay, so this is in part, the national anthem is a part of, as we know, as a part of nationhood or a statehood, broadly nationhood. Okay, that's an interesting factor. To illustrate, to illustrate the emotional allegiance of the population journey. Secondly, they attached themselves to a particular national language. That is, they try to become the national states of a certain linguistic groups. However, since these states were generally quite heterogeneous, the adoption of a national language inevitably left parts of their populations which did not speak it alienated. This caused the proliferation of nationalisms and Nation states as multiple linguistic groups of Europe now try to acquire their own states. The very thing that we are experiencing currently, the from the or we experienced earlier, the Dravidian agenda. According to Ernest Geller, the congruence between states and linguistic communities is a post-industrial phenomenon. Yes, I agree with that. You see, I agree with Ernest. Prior to the advent of the industrial age, agrarian societies were culturally fragmented and heterogeneous as they lacked mass literacy and consequently linguistic homogeneity. A privileged few monopolized literacy in these societies, and most of their populations were divided into culturally differentiated small communities. There was thus no linguistic cohesion between the elite and non-elite, and even among the non-elite. Resultantly, the typical political unit in the agrarian age was one in which a central dominant authority coexisted with semi-autonomous localities. The fusion between polity and culture happened in the industrial age because an industrial society required standardized mass literacy so that individuals were mobile, not restricted to their traditional roles. And theoretically, anyone at a job was replaceable by anyone, kind of like today's globalization. This caused the erasure of the linguistic diversity characteristics of agrarian societies as industrializing states built a national education system in which everyone was socialized, taught, and trained the same way. Okay, so mass producing workers. The result was that, according to Gellner, industrialized states identified themselves with a particular language and culture and turned into national states. Also, he contains created nations in the process. Okay, very interesting point of view. According to the political scientist Benedict Anderson, the linguistic nation state, which he termed an emerging political community, emerged in Europe in the wake of print capitalism. The invention of the printing press that made possible the publishing industry. The catalyst in the process was the Reformation, beginning in 1518. As Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, polemicized against the Catholic Church, a religious propaganda war broke out in Europe. Continuing into the next century, it created a vernacular print market. Martin Luther's writings, for example, were brought out in cheap popular editions and created large new reading publics. Apparently, as more and more people now read the same stuff in the vernacular with vocabulary, German, English, French, Spanish, etc. They were connected to each other in unified fields of exchange and communication. This, according to Anderson, provided a basis for national consequence. Much later in the 19th century, printing technology facilitated a large quantum of binary lexicographical and grammatical dictionaries and grammars of hitherto marginal languages such as Ukrainian and Norwegian were now composed and published. The result was the growth of multiple new linguistic nationalisms. As is demonstrated by Buxbaum, Gellner, and Anderson, the linguistic nation state in Europe is of relatively recent historical vintage. We learned that the modern alliance between state forms and languages might have occurred as the former sought to fulfill certain instrumentalities related to governmentality and the industrial economy. Or this alliance might be the outcome of the tremendous boost to communication and consequently the national consciousness given by printing technology. Irrespective of the precise historical circumstances that occasion the European style linguistic nation state, it is doubtless that a standardized state sponsored language serves as a conduit for state power. Think of the ease of surveillance when all citizens use the same language. Exactly. Or it legitimizes this power among the citizenry by generating a sense of belonging to the same civic, political community, national consciousness. The modern linguistic nation state thus enforces or, or buttresses its power by aligning with the language. A very interesting theory, or rather a fact. Okay, just give me 30 seconds. Then we will resume with. Yeah, so in the centuries, in the centuries before the linguistic nation state came into existence, the modern European states exhibited a cultural persona, primarily by patronizing religion. Always the rich purveyor of symbols in the form of weddings, shrines, and sacred texts. Typically, they made a visible public demonstration of their support for religion by investing in monumental sacred architecture. Take, for instance, the building projects of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. They were both numerous and very ambitious, as we learned from his autobiography, Res Gestae Devi Augusti. Augustus constructed the Senate House, restored the Capitol and theater of Pompey, and completed the Forum Julium. But he also, but he, but he also, but he also spent copiously on the science of beauty. Aristotle, Augustus declares in the Res Gestae, 82 temples of the gods and the authority of the Senate, neglecting none that required restoration at that time. I built the temple of Mars, the Avenger, Mars Cultor. The wealth lavished on his shrines by Augustus could be due to his personal pity. We do not dismiss its likelihood. However, since the Roman state was effectively coincident with the Persian of the emperor, Augustus restoring and building temples doubtless implied a grand display of the support given to the Roman religion by the Roman state. Later, when the Roman Empire renounced paganism for Christianity, it exhibited a religious aspect just as demonstrably. We saw the Roman state takes an active interest in bringing to a conclusion the theological disputes in the Christian church. The Council of the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine in 325 C, discussed and rejected Aristotle's contention that God, the Son, was the first creation of God. God the Son was the first creation of God, God the Father, and thus different in being or substance. The council declared that God the Father and Son were identical in being or substance. Since Christianity was now the imperial religion, the emperor and the officials were required to enforce one form of Christian belief against another. Following the decision at Nicaea, it was a dogma that every true Christian was now meant to adhere to. Vast resources, we are told, were expended on the exercise, and those who would not come around to the formulation of Christian belief endorsed by the emperor were excluded from the state and its protection. Later in the 532 CE, Justinian, ruler of what was now the Byzantine or the Eastern Roman Empire, began the constitution of the Grand Basilica, Hagia Sophia at Constantinople, in a truly monumental display of his Roman's Christian character. Why did Augustus restore and build the shrine of ratings, while Constantine put the whole weight of the empire behind Christianity? With Constantine, Constantine, personal pity was definitely a factor, as he was a fervent Christian. But that aside, both he and the predecessor were probably using religion to achieve greater cohesion and the smooth functioning of the Roman Imperium. The public ceremonials of paganism had a distinctly civic aspect to them. They sought to inspire and augment the Roman public's loyalty to the state. Standardized and officially sanctioned Christianity, on the other hand, could show be of help in holding an enormous and diverse empire together. Religion could indeed help a state cohere and achieve greater efficacy. We witnessed this, for example, in England in a later we witnessed this, for example, in England in a later, less civilized age when the glory of Rome had passed into history. In the words of G.M. Trevelyan, one of the most celebrated historians of England, the early adhesion of all the English kingdoms to the Roman system of religion, Catholicism, gave a great impetus towards racial unity, king and feudal power, systematic administration, legislation and taxation, and territorial against tribal politics. In simple language, Trevelyan thinks that by backing Roman Catholicism, the English kingdoms encouraged the English racial identity and ruled more efficaciously. Post-Reformation, post-Reformation, the English state and national identity acquired further cohesion. A crucial role in this seems to have been played by the large-scale dissemination of scriptural knowledge that was backed by the throne. At the start of the 17th century, the English ruler James I commissioned a version of the Bible, which largely followed an earlier text by William Tyndale, which had been composed in a plain style using everyday words and proverbs. Since they had wanted to be understood by the simple folk, even the boy that drive the plough or drive the plough. Along with the prayer book, King James Bible became a text that everyone was said to have heard, read, and memorized in England. King James Bible. By the way. This made a standard form of English familiar across the country without replacing spoken dialects. The effect of these rites, Robert Plum, must have been powerful as a constant reminder of belonging to what has been called the imagined community of nations. All the more since he points out a sense of national identity already existed in England. A state-sponsored artifact of English Protestantism, namely King James Bible, thus sharpened the sense of English national identity. One assumes that this is likely to have redounded to the strength and stability of the English state. By the way, I would like to mention it that this Protestantism or the King James Bible, the effect of this, which we are still under, has been discussed very detail in our series called British Orientalism. So check that out surely. The research in that series, and yeah, well, we are also providing presentation if you would like. You can also check that out. You can mail us on November's and provide that to you. They did the nation who like mentioned the Dravidianism and the this and the northeast the insurgency the insurgencies of northeastern states, the secessionism mentality, how it got formed, how is it how is it so how is it so mainstream, or how is it like everyone possesses it one will every Bihar here and Bihar will do another in retaliation, but vice versa. Everything comes from there. Rulers in Central and Eastern Europe similarly used religion to buttress their rule. or for its value. For example, the German emperors Henry II and Henry III willingly used their royal authority for the benefit of the church. They thus discharged the role of the just king who promotes Christian culture. In return, the clergy accepted them as divinely appointed rulers of the church and leaders who would establish a Christian society. The Tsars in neighboring Russia would sometimes make an exaggerated display of their orthodox teaching. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, extirpated Tatar power by defeating the remaining Khanates, and capturing the Tatar city of Kazan in 1552. Commemorate these achievements, he ordered the construction of the Regensburg Cathedral of the Intercession. Diarmid Macaulay, the historian of Christianity, was this building an extrovert symbol of the Tsar's joy in victory and his gratitude to Mary. The Trinity and the various saints whose intercession he had successfully invoked against the Tatars. Christianity, it seems, had served as the rallying rhetoric for even more, since he had evoked its pantheon of supernatural agencies and their help during a crucial phase in his reign. When he needed to muster forces against the Tatar foe, thus, besides being a crucial prop to its strength, religion could supply a necessary rhetoric to the state when weaker. Coming to India, one of the ways in which state and culture interacted here was through the king's role as the sustainer of dharma. As a concept, dharma is remarkably supple. However, let us give it the working definition of the cultural metrics that compromise social, moral, and political norms along with the spiritual outlook. So we have discussed the Europeans culture and how they use religion and they formed like they wrote King James Bible, spread it everywhere all over England, uh, which is a result of Protestantism. Then how it helped to form the concept of nationhood or make the people more cohesive with the nation. The interaction of state and culture in Central and Europe and India, as you can see, we have completed the Europe part. We will continue the interaction of culture and state in India in the later spring. So please, please do subscribe and uh, select the bell icon to notifications so you can that you can follow up. And please do comment and please do comment if you are liking this. If you are liking this, or in what ways do we improve, or which should we read in future. If you have any suggestion, please do comment it. We will keep it up to this only. We'll uh, continue tomorrow or day after tomorrow from here. Dharma is a concept, and we will not I guess we will not discuss dharma thoroughly. Like we will give dharma give dharma structure of our POV, or like not our POV exactly, to understand it in this political context, basically, like how it how it functions and what state it was at that time. So yeah, we'll keep it up to this only. Uh, Namaste. Jai Sri Ram, Vande Mataram.